Good afternoon. Shh, please. Thank you. I look around, I know most of you, but not all of you. I'm Kathy Miller, NAA member in good standing the last time I checked. And I'm up here today because my husband, Shyam Das, asked me to accept the heavy responsibility of introducing him on one of the most important days in his life. Now, I want you to know that I am not nervous. And I was not nervous about 15 minutes ago when I was washing my hands in the bathroom and a man who had every right to be there walked in. It's often been said that there are almost as many paths into arbitration as there are arbitrators. Shyam, as most of you know, has a relatively reserved personality. So I thought I'd use my time today to fill you in on a few previously unknown highlights about his somewhat eclectic, occasionally serendipitous path into arbitration. Shyam was born actually in England. His, oh no, that's too early. Wait. You have to bear with me. Because his father was a law student at Cambridge. His mother was a student at the London School of Economics, which temporarily had moved to London to Cambridge to avoid the bombing in London. When Shyam was 3, his parents finished their degrees, and his father accepted a position at the United Nations in New York, where he spent his career as deputy director of the Civil Rights Division. The timing of this move was auspicious for little Shyam because it happened to be the inaugural year for the United Nations International Nursery School. The first class was comprised of 28 3- to 5-year-old children of UN Secretariat members from 12 different countries. The emphasis was on cultural diversity, and as you can imagine, the media showed up in droves. This picture, which you've had a preview of already, of Shyam appeared in a spread in House and Garden magazine. I know, he's adorable, but from back there, can you get a load of that caption? It reads, "Patty cakes occupy the late play period. Shyam Das, shown here, is a great favorite with the girls." Who knew? This next photo appeared in the New York Times. I know, even the most adorable imp has those awkward periods. But I do like this photo because of the caption, which shows that already Shyam was becoming a budding wordsmith. It says, "Cuter than a bow-tied kitten, more fun than a merry-go-round. 3.5-year-old Shyam Das of India is courteous, cooperative, and speaks better English than a newspaper reporter, much better." This last photo appeared in Time magazine, and I like it because it shows that the International Nursery School had become quite savvy about promoting with the media its very early emphasis on cultural diversity. That's Shyam, not staged at all, just an average day, hanging out playing in his turban. When Shyam was 11, his education took an unusual turn. He began attending boarding school in Darjeeling, India. I know that sounds exotic, but at that time, St. Paul's was more British than the British. In fact, it was a feeder school for Cambridge. And it seems that the hope was that Shyam would finish at St. Paul's and maybe follow in his father's footsteps to Cambridge. But a problem arose. By the time Shyam had completed what in the United States would have been his sophomore year in high school, he had concluded that he absolutely did not want to go to Cambridge. So he privately hatched a plan to spring himself, and when he was home for his annual break, he sat down with his parents, and his parents heard those words that all parents dread to hear. Mom, Dad, I've made up my mind. I'm going to Harvard. Well, home he transferred, first graduating from PS 117 and then Harvard. Talk about eclectic. And at that time, his goal was to become a history professor. But after he had completed his master's in history at Chicago, by that time, he changed his mind, and he came back east, where he attended law school at Yale. When Shyam graduated, he worked for a few years as an associate in one of those huge New York law firms, Milbank Tweed. And despite the allure of the golden ring, he decided that that wasn't the life for him. So he accepted a full-time faculty position at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Interestingly, by this time, Shyam still hadn't focused on labor. He taught international law, conflicts of law, some civil procedure. But only a few years after, wait a second. Oops. Only a few years after he began teaching, he was recruited by Sylvester Garrett, former NA president, and at that time, chairman of the U.S. Steel Board of Arbitration. He was recruited by Sil to begin to hear a few arbitration cases, both expedited and regular. That was it. Shyam fell in love with this process. But there was, again, one problem. When Shyam started teaching in law school, he was 27 years old, and he started arbitrating a few years after that. And as we all know, it takes a certain amount of gravitas to be a law school professor, arguably even more to be a credible arbitrator. So what's a boy arbitrator to do? Well, I guess it worked, because 40 years later, Shyam never has looked back. Along with the rest of the mix of his practice, he is still with the U.S. Steel and United Steelworkers Board of Arbitration, last 18 of which he has been chair. When I started, I observed that Shyam has a rather reserved personality in his professional life. I want to conclude by telling you that the opposite is true in his personal life, where he does almost everything with expressiveness and often exuberance. For example, Shyam loves to cook, and on a night when it's his night to kitchen or to cook, I might enter the kitchen to find this. In fact, I did, which is why I have this photo. Shyam loves to do yoga, to run, to ski. And when we go to parties that are not work-related, Shyam absolutely loves to shout, including going a little bit softer now, and a little bit softer now. But without a doubt, Shyam's favorite thing to do in life is to spend time with our 4 wonderful children and our 5 beloved grandchildren. I am delighted that 2 of our children and their families were able to come to San Francisco to share this occasion with Shyam. Jason Doss and his partner, Jesse Oldham, Bree Miller Gould, her husband, Alex Gould, and our precious 4-month-old granddaughter, Willa. Unfortunately, Sarah Doss had a work commitment, so she, her husband, Andy Kurtz, and our 2 beautiful granddaughters, Lizzie and Rachel, were unable to be here. Samantha Tower, her husband, Tobbs Tower, and our 2 adorable grandsons, Aiden and Theo, also could not travel here, but at least there's a joyful reason for their absence, and that is, in about a week, Sam is due to present Shyam and me with grandchild number 6. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce the National Academy of Arbitrators President, Shyam Doss. Unplug this and I'll get out of your way.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I had no idea what Kathy was going to say to you or what she was going to show you. I'm afraid it's all downhill from here. But just give me a minute to compose myself. As Kathy mentioned, I was a history student before I went to law school. And the essence of a historian's work is to tell a story. As arbitrators, we often start out relating a story in our opinions, which we base on the testimony and other evidence presented to us. Recently, in speaking with my daughter, Sam, who Kathy mentioned is the one having her 3rd baby soon, Sam is working with me while she develops her own career as a labor and employment arbitrator and mediator. And in speaking to her recently, I encouraged her to develop the facts in her drafts as if she were telling a story, so as to both inform and engage the reader. My address today is a story of sorts. It's partly a personal, but mostly an institutional story about an arbitration system that you've been given some preview of by Kathy, that has been at the center of almost my entire career as an arbitrator. I heard my first case for U.S. Steel and the Steelworkers in 1975 as a special or ad hoc arbitrator for the Board of Arbitration. I've been affiliated with the board for the ensuing 40 years, serving starting in 1977 as an assistant to the chairman, then associate chairman, and since 1997 as chair. There was one 6-year hiatus when I served as umpire for Bethlehem Steel. Fortunately, when I was offered the opportunity to go back to the U.S. Steel Board, I did so because shortly thereafter, Bethlehem went bankrupt. The U.S. Steel Board originated shortly after the National Academy was founded in 1947. Shortly before, sorry. Like the Academy, it has evolved during the ensuing years. Its history is illustrative of the ways in which collective bargaining parties in a major industry have adapted their arbitration system to changing circumstances, and of the significant role arbitration has played in their collective bargaining relationship over the past 7 decades. In 1937, U.S. Steel, perhaps surprisingly given its labor history, agreed to voluntarily recognize the steelworkers. By 1942, after considerable opposition, the union had successfully organized most other basic steel industry companies. The initial grievance and arbitration procedure in the U.S. Steel contract provided for use of ad hoc arbitrators. The entry of the United States into World War II and the need for labor peace during the war led to the creation of the War Labor Board, where many of the founders of this academy got their first experience in resolving and arbitrating labor disputes. In 1945, U.S. Steel and the Steelworkers agreed to establish a board of conciliation and arbitration. And let me just pause here for a second. That's the 1945 contract. It easily fits into your shirt pocket. This is the 2012 contract. The initial board was composed of 3 members, one designated by each party and a neutral chair. The first chair was Herbert Blumer, a well-known and respected sociologist at the University of Chicago and later at Berkeley. He had arbitrated in the steel industry for the War Labor Board. The 1945 contract provided that the board shall endeavor to conciliate the grievance, hence the name Board of Conciliation and Arbitration. Failing that, the board was to proceed to arbitrate the grievance. It appears that conciliation was not a success. In the next contract, negotiated in 1947, the parties dropped that process and several years later renamed the board as simply the Board of Arbitration. Blumer was succeeded by Ralph Seward, and who later in 1947 went on to become the first president of this academy. Ralph was no slouch. He already had substantial experience as an arbitrator, most recently at General Motors, where he became the 3rd GM UAW umpire in 1944. As the U.S. Steel Board in 1947 was still a tripartite board, but as Charles Killingsworth and Saul Wallen report in an excellent paper included in the 1964 proceedings, which is of course available at the Academy's website, on the early history of permanent arbitration systems in the U.S., the partisan members of the U.S. Steel Board were advocates, not principals. Their chief function was to win decisions, not to negotiate. Executive sessions of the board became what amounted to rehearings of the important cases. Drafts of the decisions of the chairman were also discussed at length. Finally, the dissenting members of the board often issued the partisan members of the board often issued dissenting opinions couched in strong language. Interestingly, the two party members shared offices with Seward on a full-time basis. Seward described this as, quote, a goldfish bowl. Everything I said or did was observed, and every discussion we had went back to the parties. Seward also noted that the three-man board was immensely helpful in educating me to the nature of the problems and long-range disputes and long-range goals of the parties, but we got into really ridiculous situations when we were trying to sort of mediate out or negotiate the interpretations which were to be placed on words. At the end of his 2-year term, the company fired Seward. The union had fired his predecessor. There was a 1.5-year gap, and then in mid-1951, the parties retained Sylvester Garrett as chairman. He had extensive War Labor Board experience, had been a management advisor in the glass industry, and had been teaching law at Stanford. He would remain as chair until he retired from that position at the end of 1978, an impressive span of almost 30 years. Meanwhile, Seward was selected as umpire at Bethlehem Steel, a position he held for many years. In the 1952 contract, the parties eliminated the tripartite system, although to this day it remains, quote, the Board of Arbitration. Garrett, however, instituted a clearance system with the parties' approval, under which tentative drafts were sent to the parties. He later wrote that, in my judgment, this has been of almost inestimable value. First, it helps the arbitrator avoid serious error. It permits the arbitrator to delete from the opinion matter which is offensive, misleading, potentially mischievous, or simply unnecessary. Third, it gives the potentially disappointed party an opportunity to absorb the decision, understand it, and talk about it frankly with the arbitrator. Sometimes people will read a decision initially and hobgoblins will arise in their mind. They may construe it to mean something that's not intended at all. By talking, sometimes the opinion can be reshaped in order to eliminate a potential misunderstanding. He goes on to note also sometimes the parties decided they'd rather settle the case than see the opinion of the neutral arbitrator published. And sometimes they would offer additional language that they would like to see in the award. Until the 1980s, the basic steel companies bargained with the steel workers on an industry-wide basis. Negotiations were dominated on the employer side by the larger companies, in particular U.S. Steel, which was about twice the size of the next largest producer, Bethlehem. Economic terms and many other contractual provisions were bargained on this basis, and then subsequently adopted by additional smaller so-called Me Too steelworker-represented companies. As Dick Mithenthal, also a former Academy president, has noted, this gave arbitration a critical role in steel labor relations. Because the CBAs were written in general language, which could more easily be embraced by the industry as a whole, there often was ambiguity, and there was a need to apply this general language to concrete problems. All of this was left to the grievance procedure and, absent agreement by the parties, to arbitration. And predictably, there were far more cases arbitrated in steel than in other basic industries. A quick glance at B&A's labor arbitration report volumes in the 1950s shows a heavy concentration of steelworker decisions, the largest number of which are U.S. Steel decisions. And parenthetically, U.S. Steel, at least since Garrett became chair in 1951 with the party's approval, have submitted all or virtually all of their decisions to B&A a practice that continues to this day. The steelworkers also had their own publication system whereby an independent outfit would receive copies of all the, not just U.S. Steel, but all the steel industry awards, select those they thought were important, publish them, digest them, and then even put together a handbook of steel arbitration based on those decisions that was designed to be used by union grievers and advocates, but which proved of great help also to management personnel and to arbitrators. This reflected the importance placed on arbitration precedent in the steel industry, not just at a single company. And there was a clear pecking order. As Mittenthal writes, the awards of Sylvester Garrett at U.S. Steel and Ralph Seward at Bethlehem, extraordinary men with long service in this industry, were given special consideration. The clearance procedure instituted by Garrett was invaluable when the board dealt with such difficult and important issues as local working conditions, which were seen by companies as infringing on management rights, and incentives, both major sticking points for the parties. The board resolved many issues which the parties had not been able to work out in negotiations, not through interest arbitration, but by deciding grievances where the contract, due to lack of agreement, was silent or ambiguous. Garrett, who Dick Mittenthal, himself a giant in our profession, describes in his 2008 memoir as, quote, "in my opinion, the most talented arbitrator the profession has produced," close quote, later expounded, this is Garrett, "so when people talk about an arbitrator not adding to a contract, I have to laugh. I didn't alter their agreement, I didn't change anything in their agreement, but my numerous interpretations certainly added detailed meaning to their agreement. And they knew it and wanted it that way if we can judge retrospectively. And I have a feeling that the word, still Garrett, add, which is in the boilerplate phrase which typically limits the jurisdiction of an arbitrator, is perhaps mischievous. At least it may carry a connotation which is less than helpful. Any meaningful interpretive process, judicial or otherwise, inevitably adds something to an agreement in the literal sense of the word." Ben Fisher, longtime director of the Steelworkers Contract Administration Department, in addressing this academy in 1976, noted, "The role arbitration in the steel industry has played during a period of nearly 30 years must be viewed as constructive, if not decisive. It's difficult to estimate the degree to which relaxation of many tensions in collective bargaining relationships has been a byproduct of faith in the role of arbitrators." Clearly, Garrett alone could not handle all the U.S. Steel cases appealed to arbitration, and the contract allowed the chair, in consultation with the parties, to employ one or more assistants, quote, "to analyze cases, conduct hearings, and recommend decisions for approval by the chair." Special arbitrators had been used from time to time on an ad hoc basis, but starting around 1960, Garrett began to hire a number of full-time assistants who in essence were brought into the board as apprentice arbitrators. At Bethlehem, Ralph Seward did the same thing, and some other permanent steel company umpires also utilized assistants. Among the early assistants at U.S. Steel were Mick McDermott, Al Dybeck, both presidents of this academy, and Ed McDaniel. Dybeck ultimately would succeed Garrett and serve as board chair from 1979 through 1996. The second generation of assistants was hired in the mid to late 1970s. These included Helen Witt, James Beilstein, and myself, and somewhat later, David Peterson and Elizabeth Newmeyer. At times, additional arbitrators were utilized on an ad hoc basis due to the sheer number of cases. Both Garrett and Dybeck, with the parties' full support, sought out both women and African American arbitrators to serve in this capacity. I'd like to briefly describe what it was like to be an assistant or associate chair, positions I served in from 1977 to 1990. We were retained usually on a 3-year contracts at a fixed salary. We were provided office space and secretarial help at the board's offices in Pittsburgh. We spent a week touring steel mills, seeing the entire process of the production of steel from the coke works to the finished products. And some of the ad hoc arbitrators also were able to do that. If you've never been in a steel mill, it is quite an experience. It gives you a sense of how small we are as people, in a way. We did not, as assistants, need to worry about having enough work. After a year or two at the board, we were even allowed to handle a limited number of outside cases for other parties, which gave us the opportunity to develop broader acceptability. We all shared offices, we talked about our cases and experiences, and if Garrett and later Dybeck were in town, he frequently corralled the others in the office and took us out to lunch. I'll say for another time a description of going to lunch with Sil Garrett. We learned much more than we realized at those convivial lunches. That was back when cocktails were still consumed at lunch. Postprandial productivity suffered as a consequence. Until sometime in the 1990s, assistants typically were scheduled once a month for 4 consecutive days of hearing at or near the location of one of the company's plants. I should add that until the bottom fell out of the steel industry in the 1980s, we flew first class. Garrett observed the top company and union officials did that, and it would be unbecoming for us not to do so. We might hear as many as 8 cases in those 4 days, many without transcripts. It was grueling but exciting. The parties provided pre-hearing briefs with copies of the grievance records. Post-hearing briefs were extremely rare. At one time, no longer alas, it was not uncommon to socialize with the advocates you were spending the week with. The company was represented by arbitration attorneys from headquarters in Pittsburgh. The union advocates almost always were staff representatives, not lawyers. As Kathy mentioned, when I heard my first cases, I was in my early 30s and looked much younger, or so I thought. At least at the outside, I had little credibility in my own right. But what I did have was the institutional credibility of the board. Every decision issued by the board had to be reviewed and approved by the chair, which remains true today. Garrett didn't encourage discussion of a case before I drafted an opinion, but then would offer advice on how to improve the draft and invaluable insight to what the case really was about, and he would discuss the relevant precedents, most of which he had authored. Sometimes, not often, the result needed to be changed. Always there was praise for what I had done well and encouragement. I got the same later from Al Dybeck. I could not have asked for 2 better mentors and leaders. I mentioned the review session previously. Periodically, review sessions were held in the chair's office. Assistants individually were called in and expected to fend for themselves when the cases were up for discussion. The party representatives were not shy about questioning the accuracy or rationale of a draft they disagreed with. I cannot say this was a pleasant experience, but it spurred me on to write the best draft decision I could, in part because I knew I might have to defend it in one of those sessions, and it honed my ability to think on my feet. If it looked like the discussion was becoming too uncomfortable, Garrett or Dybeck usually would step in and bring the discussion to a close, indicating there could be no other sound result than that I had reached in my decision, although perhaps certain findings or language might best be excised or revised. Almost never was the bottom line changed. That was not the purpose of the review system. The steel industry in the United States today is significantly diminished in relative size and importance, contrasted to what it was even 35 years ago. In 1955, U.S. Steel was the second largest private employer in the country. It was number 3 on the Fortune 500 list. Today, U.S. Steel is closer to 40,000 employees. Nonetheless, it remains an important and vital part of our manufacturing economy, and I believe remains the largest domestic integrated steel producer in the U.S. As the industry has changed, so have the hot issues submitted to arbitration, and indeed the operation of the board itself. Job security issues long have been a primary focus of collective bargaining in steel and other manufacturing industries. When domestic steel production underwent drastic reductions in the 80s, in part due to cheaper imports, the union placed primary emphasis on reining in subcontracting. I'm going to skip some important portions here. In the early 80s, the union filed a huge number of grievances as it saw its jobs dwindling and increased use of contractors by the company in its effort to reduce costs and remain competitive. In 1986, by which time industry-wide bargaining had ended, the union succeeded in negotiating considerably stronger and more comprehensive protection against subcontracting with all the major producers other than U.S. Steel. Following a 6-month work stoppage in 1986, the U.S. Steel parties reached a settlement with the assistance of then former board chair Garrett, which included most of the provisions sought by the union. These new provisions were extremely detailed, running to multiple pages of the contract, and spawned many grievances that filled much of the board's docket over the next years. Among the changes was the institution of an expedited procedure designed to permit arbitrations to be scheduled, heard, and decided when possible before the work and dispute was performed. At some steel companies where this procedure was invoked relatively infrequently, it worked more or less as intended. At U.S. Steel, however, the sheer volume of cases soon overwhelmed the board's ability to process cases in strict accordance with the contract. Moreover, because of the time constraints, these expedited cases were excluded from the review system that had proved beneficial to the parties and the board, even though some were among the most important cases to the parties and might involve significant interpretive issues. By the time the parties negotiated their next agreement in 1991, there were some 8,000 grievances pending arbitration. While certain types of contracting out disputes were heard expeditiously because the agreement required a decision before the company could contract out the work, other matters languished indefinitely. Moreover, non-contracting out grievances, except for discipline and discharge cases, were so far back in the pecking order that, as one former top company executive recently put it to me, there was little hope that they would be heard while the issues raised still were relevant to anyone. In an effort to alleviate this situation, the parties in 1991 implemented 2 changes to the arbitration process. They adopted an experimental grievance screening procedure under which the parties would agree to present a grievance record with brief explanations to a screening arbitrator who would then, in effect, issue a bench advisory award, which the parties were not required to accept. And if they chose not to accept it, they would proceed to have it arbitrated before a different arbitrator. This, of course, placed a premium on the credibility of the screening arbitrator, so it was no surprise that Garrett was chosen for the job. The parties also hired Joe Sharnoff, who had substantial experience arbitrating cases at Bethlehem Steel, to assist Chairman Dybeck in processing contracting out cases at the board. Both these mechanisms were relatively short-lived, but they reflected the parties' ability and desire to adapt the arbitration process to deal with exigent circumstances. In 2003, the parties again made major changes in their contract and again changed their contracting out provisions, spawning many grievances. In 2008, however, just before the Great Recession, the parties entered into a new contract in which, on an experimental basis, The contracting out provisions of the contract were suspended in return for guaranteed manning levels and substantial overtime opportunities for maintenance workers. The parties seemed to have agreed they were spending too much time, effort, and money on contracting out disputes, and that there had to be a better way to achieve their respective goals. Since 1997, there have been no assistants employed at the board. As chair, I have been assisted by a number of experienced arbitrators, mostly here in this room today. There are now 2, although there have been as many as 5, whom the parties agree to use on a year-to-year basis to hear cases on up to 2 days a month and to recommend decisions. I should note that one of the board's arbitrators is the Academy's current secretary-treasurer, David Peterson, who has arbitrated for the board on a continuous basis for over 35 years. Dybeck and Mick McDermott, one of the most wonderful people you could ever know, also served as secretaries of the Academy. A final note, and I have a longer paper that will be published in the proceeding. Since the founding of the Academy in 1947, all the chairs of the U.S. Steelworker Board of Arbitration, there have been only 4, Ralph Seward, Sylvester Garrett, Alfred Dybeck, and myself, have served as president of this Academy. I am immensely proud to be part of that company. Thank you.